Would you believe a dog could uncover a truth that dozens of people missed? Something so heartbreaking and unexpected that it silenced an entire funeral, made a grieving family freeze in place, and left even the funeral director visibly shaken. Because that's exactly what happened on a quiet, overcast morning in late October, when a loyal German shepherd named Gunnar refused to leave the side of a closed casket, its growls turning into barks, louder, more desperate, more alert than anyone had ever seen, and as mourners stood in shock, unsure whether to pull him away or let him speak in the only way he knew how, something inside that coffin would change everything they thought they understood about what happened to the man they were burying. But to truly understand how we got to that moment, to the sound of Gunnar's paws clawing against the polished wood as if he knew there was still something or someone that didn't belong in there, we have to go back a few weeks, to a small American town nestled between wooded hills and long-forgotten war memorials, a place where everyone knew each other by name, where old habits and small routines built a quiet life that for most was enough, especially for James Rutledge. A retired Army sergeant with a strong jaw, a kind voice, and eyes that had seen. More than they'd ever say out loud, he was the kind of man who stood up straight even when no one was watching, who always opened the door for others, who still ironed his shirts each morning, even though he no longer had to report to anyone. He lived alone in a modest white house with green shutters that had started to peel a little. But he didn't mind, because that house held memories. It held the ghost of laughter, of promises, of goodbyes. It held the silence he'd come to accept as part of life. The silence broken only by the soft padding of Gunnar's paws across the floor, the deep exhale of a dog who never left his side. Gunnar wasn't just a pet, he was a fellow soldier. Trained for combat, retired like James, and yet somehow more watchful, more alive, more attuned to emotion than any human James had ever met. They ate together. They walked the same route each morning through the crunchy autumn leaves. They sat side by side on the porch at dusk, watching the sky shift from gold to gray without saying a word, and on the surface, everything seemed fine. The kind of peaceful retirement most people would envy. But something started to change. Small things at first. It's like James missing his morning walk for the first time in years, or forgetting to refill Gunnar's water bowl, or sitting in the living room with the television off, just staring at the blank screen, and Gunnar noticed. He always noticed. He'd nudge James with his nose. Bring him the leash even when James didn't ask. And James would smile, ruffle the thick fur between Gunnar's ears, and whisper, "I'm just tired, buddy," but Gunnar didn't buy it, because he remembered how James used to move with purpose, with life, and this wasn't that, so he stayed. Even closer, began sleeping not just at the foot of the bed, but beside it, ears twitching at every sound. Eyes locked on James's chest, rising and falling in the dark. And then, one morning, that rhythm changed. Gunnar woke up with a start, and the silence was wrong, too still, he barked. Then howled, pawed at James's chest, but there was no movement. No breath, no answer, and in that instant, Gunnar let out a sound that no one in the neighborhood would forget, a sound of loss, of alarm, of something more. Because even then, even in that first moment, Gunnar knew that this wasn't just sleep. And when the paramedics arrived, followed by the police, followed by a neighbor who sobbed as she watched the gurney roll away, Gunnar didn't move. He sat in the doorway, silent now, but alert. Eyes locked on the men loading his person into the van, and in that moment, everyone knew this wasn't just a dog, this was family, and that's why. 3 days later, when they held the funeral, and the casket draped in the American flag sat under the cloudy sky, and 100 mourners in black lined the grass, it wasn't surprising that Gunnar was there, sitting front and center. Leash tied loosely to the chair where James's brother sat with wet eyes and trembling hands. But what no one expected was what happened as they began to lower the casket, as the minister spoke the final words and silence fell over the field. Gunnar began to whine, then growl, low and steady, and then he lunged, snapping the leash with a strength no one had ever seen, placing both paws on the casket lid and barking with a fury that startled even the strongest men there. His eyes wide, his body rigid, as if he was warning them, trying to stop something, trying to speak in the Only way he could, and the crowd gasped, unsure whether to pull him away or listen, because in that moment, Gunnar wasn't just grieving, he was protesting. And his body language said one thing louder than any words ever could: there's something wrong in there. Something doesn't make sense. And even though the funeral director tried to maintain order, and a few men stepped forward to restrain, the dog, the brother of the deceased, held up his hand and said, "Wait." Because he had seen that look in Gunnar's eyes before, back when James first brought him home from deployment. Back when the dog had sensed landmines buried under Afghan sand, and he knew, deep down, that Gunnar was trying to tell them something. And that's when the tension in the air thickened, when hands froze mid-reach, when the woman holding the folded flag to her chest took a trembling step back. Because if Gunnar was right, then everything they believed about James's death might be wrong. And nobody was prepared for what would happen next. Nobody could have predicted the chain of events that would follow the simple act of a dog refusing to let his human be buried without someone listening to him first. And as the wind rustled through the graveyard trees and Gunnar let out one last piercing bark, the world held its breath, waiting for the truth to rise with the dead and maybe, just maybe, be heard. The silence that followed Gunnar's final bark was thick enough to choke on, a stillness that blanketed the cemetery like fog, where even the birds that had chirped moments earlier now sat quietly in the trees as if listening to and for several seconds. No one moved, no one spoke. The minister stood frozen, with his hands mid-gesture, the honor guard unsure whether to resume the flag folding, the crowd gripping tissues and programs tighter, waiting for someone to say something, to give permission for this surreal moment to either pass or deepen. And it was James's brother, David, who finally broke the spell, stepping forward, his polished shoes crunching softly on the frostbitten grass. His eyes locked on the dog, who had gone from quiet companion to emotional alarm bell in a matter of moments, and with a voice hoarse and hesitant, said, "Open it." And the funeral director blinked, glanced at the military supervisor with raised brows, then at the mortuary assistant, standing off to the side, clutching the lid latch. Unsure, unnerved, clearly not expecting to be asked to do something so unusual, so emotional, and yet the weight of David's request. The urgency in his tone was backed by something deeper, something everyone in that moment could feel but not name. So, with hesitant hands and a heart pounding loud enough to echo through his ribcage, the assistant nodded and slowly approached, the casket carefully folding back the edge of the flag, fingers trembling slightly as they found the brass latches and unhooked them. One by one, each soft metallic click louder than the last, and as the lid was lifted, the crowd leaned in, breath held. Some expecting to see nothing unusual, others too afraid to even guess, and Gunnar still pressed against the base of the coffin stared with laser focus into the now opened space, his growl low and steady, a sound that pulsed through the legs of everyone nearby like a warning from beneath the earth. And there, lying peacefully in his military uniform with hands folded over his chest, was James Rutledge, eyes closed, face calm, looking as if he might wake up at any moment. Except Gunnar wasn't looking at James's face. He was focused on James's chest, more specifically, the edge of his coat lapel, where something dark and unnatural seemed to be tucked just beneath the fold. It was barely visible. Maybe no one would have noticed it if not for the dog's intense focus. But David saw it too now, something off about the way the jacket sat. So he leaned in, hand reaching slowly as if asking for permission, then gently pulled back the fabric, revealing something that should not have been there, a small black velvet pouch. Old, dusted with time, its strings wrapped twice and tucked tight as if someone didn't want it found. And for a moment, everyone just stared, unsure what it meant, unsure who placed it there. And David turned to Ward, the funeral director, who shook his head slowly, lips parting to say he'd never seen it before, that it wasn't listed among the personal effects, that the body had been cleaned, dressed, and sealed per protocol, and there was no mention of a pouch. And now the crowd leaned in closer, curiosity blooming through their grief like an uninvited. Weed and Gunnar began to whine softly, no longer barking, but trembling with anxious energy. ears twitching as if expecting something bad, and with careful fingers, David untied the strings and opened the pouch, revealing something that drew gasps from those near enough to see. Inside was a set of dog tags. ... but not James's. These were older, faded, and belonged to someone named Michael J. Rutledge. And beneath them, a child's silver bracelet, tiny and delicate, with a name engraved in cursive. Lacey, a name that no one recognized, not even David, and his confusion deepened as he looked to the casket again. Suddenly remembering something James had said during one of their last conversations, something cryptic about debts not paid and stories not told, about people that mattered slipping through the cracks. And Gunnar, now sitting beside the casket, let out a soft, whimpering howl, not of pain, but of recognition, of sadness. And David knew in that moment that his brother had buried a secret deep in his heart, something unresolved, something he had taken to the grave. And Gunnar somehow had known, had tried to tell someone, had fought to stop the burial, not because of what was inside the coffin, because of what was inside the man, memories, burdens, names, maybe even guilt. And David stood up slowly, cradling the pouch in both hands, and looked out at the crowd, searching for a face, any face that might show recognition. But all he saw were wide eyes and furrowed brows, confusion painted across each expression, until a voice from the back, quiet and aged, spoke out and said, "Michael J. Rutledge." I knew him, and heads turned as an elderly woman stepped forward, cane tapping the earth with each step, her eyes misty and rimmed with time, and she continued, "He was James's father. But he died in Vietnam, or at least that's what we were told." And the silence returned again, now sharper, more pointed, the kind that makes the back of your neck itch. And David looked down at the dog tags in his hand, suddenly understanding that James had carried a piece of his father with him all these years, maybe even discovered something about his father's fate that he never shared. And the bracelet, Lacey's bracelet. Who was she? A sister, a daughter, someone lost in a story no one had ever told. And Gunnar, still watching, rested his head gently on the edge of the casket, eyes filled with the kind of knowing only a dog could carry. And it was in that moment that David decided the burial could not go on. Not yet, not until the questions were answered, not until this mystery, this message from beyond, was understood. And so the casket was closed again, not lowered, but gently placed back onto the platform, the flag carefully restored, and the crowd was asked respectfully to return home, that the funeral would be postponed. And as the people filtered away, murmuring in low voices, casting glances back at the soldier and his dog, a quiet understanding settled over them, a respect for the mystery, a reverence for the bond between man and animal. And back at the casket, David knelt beside Gunnar, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and whispered, "We'll figure this out, I promise." And in response, Gunnar gave a soft, low oof, the kind that said thank you, that said finally. That said he wasn't crazy, just unheard. And now, maybe, they were finally listening. And if you're still watching this story unfold, if you felt something stir in your chest the way that dog did when he first barked at the coffin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it over there, and more importantly, has your dog ever sensed something? You didn't. Has your dog ever done something that made you believe they understand far more than we think? Because we're just getting started, and what comes next will shake even the strongest hearts. The sun had long dipped behind the trees by the time the cemetery emptied, leaving behind only the rustle of dry leaves, the distant hum of a passing car, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of a dog who refused to leave his place beside the raised casket. And David Rutledge, too, remained, seated on the small folding chair just a few feet away, holding the velvet pouch in both hands, his thumbs rubbing over the fabric as if hoping it might reveal answers without being opened again, while Gunnar kept his eyes on the casket, not in fear, but in loyalty, as if guarding his soldier, his friend, his mission. And in that moment, David realized that his brother's death, once thought to be the quiet end to a quiet life, was in fact the beginning of a puzzle whose pieces had been buried in silence for decades. So he stood slowly, joints aching, mind racing, and gently clipped the leash back onto Gunner's collar, though it wasn't necessary, because Gunner would have followed him anywhere. And they walked together through the gate, past rows of gravestones bearing the names of ancestors and strangers, their footsteps the only sound in the evening air. And by the time they reached the truck, David had made up his mind he wasn't going to let this lie, not when Gunner had gone to such lengths to get their attention. Not when there were names and objects and histories surfacing like wreckage from the bottom of a long-forgotten river. So he opened the door. Gunner jumped in without hesitation, and they drove home in silence. The soft rattle of dog tags and the low hum of the engine, the only soundtrack to a night that felt like the opening chapter of a book neither of them had read before. And when they arrived at David's small two-story home, tucked behind a row of tall pines, Gunner leapt down and sniffed the air cautiously, as if expecting shadows to speak, and followed David up the steps, through the front door and into the soft warmth of a space that still smelled like coffee and the faded remnants of his late wife's vanilla candles. And that night, after placing the pouch on the kitchen table and watching Gunner curl up by the fireplace with a sigh that felt both relieved and alert, David poured himself a glass of whiskey, not out of habit, but because he needed something to anchor him. And then he sat down and began to write. A letter to the VA office, a message to James's old unit, an email to the funeral home requesting a pause on the burial, and most importantly, a request to the records department for anything they had on Michael J. Rutledge. And when he finally climbed into bed, Gunner padded in and lay down just inside the door, head resting on his paws, eyes open, watching, always watching. And the next morning, David found himself walking the same loop James used to take, down Maple Street, past the bakery where the owner was setting out fresh loaves, past the library where the same old man sat on the bench reading his same yellowed newspaper. And people stopped him, asked how he was doing, offered condolences, but also asked questions, because word had gotten out. Small towns move stories faster than wind. And soon everyone knew that something had stopped the funeral, that the dog had found something, and that maybe, just maybe, James hadn't died of natural causes, and that wasn't what David wanted to believe. Not yet, but he had to admit, the pouch, the tags, the bracelet, it all pointed to something hidden, something unresolved. And as the days passed and documents began arriving in the mail, dusty records in thick envelopes, military paperwork, stamped with faded dates, typed in machines that had long since been discarded, David began piecing together a story he never knew his family had lived through. And what he found changed everything. Michael J. Rutledge had indeed served in Vietnam. But his status wasn't as clear as they'd been told, because while one report declared him Kia in 1973, another, dated 1975, marked confidential, indicated he'd been seen alive in a POW camp weeks after the official date. And another even later memo hinted at possible repatriation, though no follow-up ever confirmed it. And then a series of communications between a young James Rutledge and a private investigator in the 1990s appeared. Spent years of his adult life trying to track down the truth, hiring people, visiting old bases, contacting other veterans, and in one handwritten letter, now yellowed and trembling with emotion, James wrote, "If I ever find proof, I'll bury it with me." And now David understood. The pouch wasn't just a memento. It was a promise kept, a legacy sealed, and perhaps a message to be uncovered. When the time was right, and Gunner, now more relaxed at David's side, but still keenly alert whenever someone new visited the house, seemed to settle only when that pouch was near, almost like he understood its importance. Like he had been waiting for this moment for years, and the deeper David dug, the more he found, including the name Lacey, which surfaced in a long-forgotten birth record from a base hospital in Germany, listing Michael J. Rutledge as the father and a woman named Elsa Hartman as the mother, a liaison that had never made it into family lore. And David's heart broke a little then, realizing that James had likely discovered a half-sister he never met, maybe even corresponded with her. Maybe that bracelet had been hers, sent to him in a letter he never shared. And suddenly James's loneliness, his quiet habits, his long walks and silent stares made more sense. He had carried the weight of 2 generations of silence, And when he died, he passed it to the only creature who had ever truly listened. And that's when David decided to go public, to write a letter to the local newspaper, to tell the town not just about the funeral interruption, but about the legacy of one man and his dog, about how loyalty doesn't end with death, and how sometimes the truth comes wrapped not in words, but in fur and bark and unrelenting devotion. And the letter went viral, picked up by national outlets, and soon people from across the country were reaching out, veterans offering stories, families with lost records, even someone claiming to know the Hartman family in Berlin. And through it all, Gunnar remained the silent thread. The reminder that this wasn't just about uncovering history, it was about listening, really listening. To the ones who love us enough to bark when something's wrong, even if no one else hears it. And as you sit there watching this unfold, as your own dog rests nearby, or you think about a dog you once loved, ask yourself, have they ever tried to tell you something you didn't understand in the moment, but now makes sense? Because these animals, they don't speak in sentences, but in truth, and sometimes that's louder than anything else. So tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Because you're now part of this story too. A story about a man who carried secrets, a dog who carried loyalty, and a brother who refused to let the silence win. By the time the letter was picked up by national news, David was receiving so many emails he could barely keep up. Messages from journalists, old veterans, amateur historians, even families of other POZs who had gone missing during the war, each one adding a layer of validation to the story he was starting to piece together. And through it all, Gunnar never left his side. His movement around the house slow but deliberate, always circling the table when David sat down to read, always lying near the box where David now kept the velvet pouch, as if guarding it, not from danger, but from being forgotten again. And when CNN called, asking to do a piece on the dog that delayed a funeral, David hesitated at first, unsure whether he wanted his brother's life to be reduced to a headline. But something in the way Gunnar lifted his head when the reporter said James's name convinced him to say yes. Because if this story could help one other family find closure, if it could teach one person to pay closer attention to their dogs' signals, then maybe it was worth it. And so they filmed in the backyard. The cameras rolling as David recounted the moment Gunnar barked at the coffin, how the pouch had changed everything, and Gunnar, now lying calmly in the sun, let out a small sigh, as if he knew his story was finally being told. And days after, the segment aired. A package arrived, brown paper, no return address. Only a single line on the note inside, she was real. He never stopped looking for her, and David opened the box to find a stack of letters, yellowed with age, written in shaky handwriting, all addressed to James Rutledge, all signed Lacey. And his hands trembled as he read the first one. Her words innocent at first, full of hope, asking if he was the man her mother once loved, if he remembered a woman named Elsa, if he had ever wondered why he wore a bracelet that didn't fit. And each letter grew heavier, filled with questions, updates, desperate attempts to connect, and the last one was dated just 2 years before James died, written after a long silence, and it read, "I hope you're okay. I hope you found peace. I'm still waiting." And David realized then that James had carried that bracelet not just as a memory, but as a promise, silent vow that he would not rest until he found her in Gunnar. Perhaps sensing the emotional weight of what David now held, came over and gently rested his head on David's knee. Eyes upturned, breath slow, and David stroked the soft fur behind his ears and whispered, "He never gave up, did he?" And in response, Gunnar let out the softest sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something in between, like agreement, like acknowledgement, like relief. And later that night, David sat in front of the fireplace, with the box of letters beside him, and began drafting a reply to the address listed on the envelopes, not knowing if it would reach her, not knowing if she was still alive, but needing to try. Because this story wasn't just about uncovering secrets, it was about finishing something James had started. And over the next week, the town rallied around them. People dropping off meals, veterans offering their stories, children leaving thank you notes addressed to Gunnar, And something shifted in the community, a new kind of respect forming, not just for the fallen, but for the dogs who stood beside them, who remembered when humans forgot, who barked when others stayed silent. And Gunnar, now aging but still strong, became something of a local guardian. His photo hanging in the town hall, with the caption he protected more than just one man. Still, the mystery lingered, the question of what exactly James had discovered. What had driven him to keep it hidden? And when the Department of Defense finally responded to David's FOIA request, what they included stunned him: declassified memos, transcripts, and one photograph, grainy in black and white, showing 3 men behind barbed wire, one of whom bore an uncanny resemblance to a young James Rutledge. And suddenly David's heart stopped, because if that was James, then either the date was wrong, or someone had faked his death long ago. But more likely it was Michael, his father, alive far longer than anyone was told, and the implications of that truth echoed through David's chest like thunder. And Gunnar, who had been lying quietly beside the table, suddenly stood up, walked to the window, and let out a single low bark. And David followed his gaze to see a car pulling into the driveway, unfamiliar, sleek. And when the door opened, a woman stepped out, maybe in her mid-50s, tall, composed, and carrying a small leather satchel. And David's breath caught, because in her face he saw pieces of James, the same set to the jaw, the same eyes. And when she knocked, David opened the door slowly, heart pounding, and she said, "My name is Lacey Hartman, and I believe we're family." And the next moments passed in a blur, a rush of emotion, of introductions, of stories shared and tears shed. And Gunnar, instead of barking or sniffing cautiously, simply walked to her, placed his head against her thigh, and stayed there, as if he'd always known she was part of the story. And that night, sitting together on the porch, Lacey told David everything: how her mother had met Michael during his stationing in Germany, how they had fallen in love quickly, how he had been reassigned suddenly and never returned, how her mother had always believed he died in war, but one day received a postcard, unsigned, with only a drawing of a dog in a mountain, and she never spoke of it again. And Lacey said she had always wondered, had searched sporadically but lost hope, until the news story appeared, until she saw the pouch on the television screen, the bracelet, her bracelet, and she had known in that instant that it was real. And now here they were, decades of silence unraveling in one night, and Gunnar, now curled at their feet, let out a small sigh, the kind that said this was right, that the weight was finally lifting. And as the stars came out and the world slowed, David turned to Lacey and said, "He wanted to find you. He carried you with him." And she smiled, tears in her eyes, and said, "And his dog made sure he did." And that moment, that beautiful moment, was the beginning of healing, not just for them, but for every person who had followed the story, for every veteran who had wondered if someone still remembered, for every dog lover who now watched their own pet with new eyes, wondering what truths lay beneath the surface of a simple bark or stare. And if you're one of them, watching right now, ask yourself, could your dog be carrying something you've missed? And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Because this isn't just a story. This is a reminder that love endures, that silence speaks, and that sometimes it takes a dog to open a coffin full of truth. The morning after Lacey arrived, everything felt different. Not just for David, not just for Gunnar, but for the entire town. It was as if the house, once heavy with silence and mystery, had taken a long, deep breath and finally exhaled. And Gunnar, who had always moved with quiet intention, now walked a little lighter, not because he was younger or stronger, but because the weight he had carried, the unspoken grief, the unfinished story, was finally being lifted. And that day began with the kind of golden sunlight that seemed to linger longer than it should, painting everything in the soft warmth of healing. And as David brewed coffee and Lacey opened the box of letters once again, they sat together on the porch where James used to drink his tea, both of them reading and remembering, filling in the blanks left behind by a man who had loved deeply but spoken rarely. And across from them, lying on his side, belly up to the morning rays, was Gunnar, his eyes closed, his ears twitching slightly with each passing bird call. And for the first time in what felt like years, he was truly resting, not watching, not guarding, just existing in the peace he had earned. And as they read through the final letter, the one James had written just weeks before his passing, sealed, but never mailed, they both grew still, because it wasn't addressed to Lacey or David, or even to anyone by name. It was addressed to the one who finally listens, and the letter spoke of regret, of a life spent searching, a love never forgotten, and a sister never met. But also of faith, faith in his dog, faith that if he failed to finish the story, Gunnar would know what to do, and that somehow the truth would be barked into the world loud enough that someone, anyone, would finally hear it. And David folded the letter slowly, his eyes misty, and said he trusted him more than anyone. And Lacey nodded, reaching down to scratch Gunnar behind the ears, and whispered he was right too. And in that quiet moment, the three of them, man, woman, and dog, formed a kind of family bound not by blood, but by truth. And over the following weeks, everything began to fall into place. The Department of Defense confirmed that James had compiled one of the largest personal archives on unaccounted-for POs in the country. His notes so detailed that they offered leads even military records had missed. And a team was assembled to investigate further. A memorial fund was set up in James's name, not just for veterans, but for service dogs who often went forgotten, and Gunnar became the face of it. His story shared in schools and veteran halls across the nation, a symbol of loyalty, of quiet heroism, of the deep intelligence that lives in the eyes of a dog, who has seen more than he can ever say. And when the day finally came to hold the funeral again, this time with answers, with Lacey seated beside David, and Gunnar no longer needing to bark in protest, the air at the cemetery felt entirely different, the sky wide and blue, the trees calm, the crowd larger than before, not just locals now, but people from across the country who had followed the story, people who had brought their dogs, who stood with leashes in hand and tears in their eyes. And when the casket was lowered, with the pouch placed gently on top, alongside the folded flag and James's medals, Gunnar stood quietly at David's side, eyes forward, posture proud, and though he didn't bark, though he didn't whimper, his presence said everything that needed to be said. And after the last salute, after the bugle call faded into the breeze, David knelt beside Gunnar, placed a hand on his chest, and whispered, "You did it, boy." And Gunnar licked his hand, gently, his tail thumping once, and from that moment forward, everything became a little more open, a little more honest. Lacey decided to stay in town, moving into a small cottage just a few blocks away, and every morning she would walk with Gunnar and David down Maple Street, past the bakery, past the library, past the little white house with the peeling green shutters where it all began. And people would wave, children would pet Gunnar and say thank you, and sometimes veterans would stop David just to say they remembered someone too, someone lost and unnamed, and that James's story had given them hope. And Gunnar, always calm, always steady, would let them scratch behind his ears, his eyes soft, his presence healing, and eventually the town built a small statue near the memorial wall, not of a soldier, not of a flag, but of a dog, one paw raised, head turned slightly as if listening for something just beneath the surface of silence. And below it, engraved in stone, were the words, "For the one who finally listened." And if you visit that town today, you'll see people sit near that statue with their own dogs, telling stories, leaving flowers, and sometimes just sitting in silence. Because they know now what James knew, what David learned, and what Gunnar never stopped believing, that dogs remember. That they carry our stories even when we forget, that they watch, they wait, and when the moment comes, they speak not with words, but with loyalty, with movement, with the kind of instinct we too often ignore. And if you're still watching, if your heart has stayed with us through this entire journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? And if your dog could tell a story about you, what would it be? Because this isn't just a story about a man and a mystery. This is a reminder that every dog you love carries something sacred, and all they need is for you to listen.